Qualifying for round 14 of the 2023 Formula One season is done and dusted, and it was all over the place in Zandvoort. We've got 6 different teams making up the 6 top places, and some big names dropping out in Q2, and a couple of red flags to really dial up the pressure during Q3 as well. It really was an entertaining qualifying session, so let's talk it through. Let's talk about all the statistics that you need to know, all the stuff that we need to know going into tomorrow's race, and whether or not Max Verstappen can go from making it 3 out of 3 to 3 out of 3 in the Grand Prix as well. Let's talk about the tyres first and foremost, and the tyres that we saw during qualifying. Started the session on the intermediate tyre after we saw a wet free practice 3 session. I warned you during the preview that it was going to be wet this weekend on the Saturday, and it came true. And then the dry line just really opened up only for Q3 right towards the end there. Played into McLaren's hands, I would say, and kind of played against Aston Martin and Mercedes, who were much quicker in free practice 3 than they were in free practice 1 and free practice 2. Let's talk about Q1 though in particular. The eliminations being Joe, Ocon, Magnussen, Bottas and Lawson. Lawson had a clean qualifying, but he was quite far off the pace realistically. Ended up about 1.2 seconds off the rest of the grid. And you know what? Coming into this weekend, it was a very difficult track for him to try and learn just off the bat. He had one free practice session where he did have a little bit of a spin. He did okay. I feel like Monza is a bit more of a judgment on how good he actually is in Formula One. Bottas, surprisingly slow after a really good free practice 1 and free practice 2, but maybe the wet weather really did play against the Alfa Romeos. And then Hamilton just got through after having to not having time to pit at the end there for an extra set of intermediate tyres. Although we'll get onto Hamilton a little bit sooner than we'd have hoped to. First and foremost, I wanted to talk about the Haas cars because, again, Kevin Magnussen was terrible compared to his teammate. And if we look at just their Q1 times in comparison to each other, you can see the first sector in particular, Kevin Magnussen is all over the place. Like, yes, okay, Nico Hülkenberg has the upgraded front wing, whereas Kevin missed out on the upgraded front wing, and I'm quite glad he did because he shunted in free practice 3, but even though that is the case, Gunther Steiner even said that shouldn't have made too much of a difference, especially in the intermediate conditions, and you can see just Kevin Magnussen all over the place, and then in the second sector as well, actually, just any of those really hard braking points in the first half of the lap, maybe didn't have his tyres warmed up in the same way that Nico Hülkenberg did, but Kevin Magnussen all over the shop and Nico Hülkenberg much quicker, even though Kevin Magnussen was much better in a straight line. So again, maybe Nico Hülkenberg running a slightly higher downforce setup that was set up a little bit more for these wet weather conditions. Then I wanted to also talk about Joe, who just missed out to Logan Sargent, and for me, it was the first sector, really. The Williams car is so good in that first sector through T1, 2, and 3. Like, Joe just falls a couple of tenths behind straight off the bat. You can see coming out of turn 1, he's already 2 tenths down. Nearly makes that back up, but then coming out of turn 3, again is 2 tenths down. Logan Sargent almost hands it back to him. And again, I think we'll talk about Logan Sargent and the fact that he's a rookie and the fact that it's still showing in this second half of the season. But turn 10, he actually makes a mistake and opened the door, but luckily had a much better pace through the final corners and was able to make it to the line in a little bit better time than Zhou Guanyu. But very close between those two, and a little bit unfortunate for Zhou, who I thought could have just snuck through had things gone slightly differently. Then moving through into Q2, we saw Stroll, Gasly, Hamilton, Tsunoda and Hülkenberg all go through. It was kind of a last across the line battle. This was where the track was really starting to dry up, and there was even a hint of possibly some drivers going into the soft compound tyre right at the end of this session. Nobody decided to, but Hülkenberg and Tsunoda probably expected, especially as it was those intermediate too soft conditions almost, and the fact that the cars in front of them, you know, you look at the cars that made it through, the Mercedes, the Red Bulls, they were much quicker on the day. So Hülkenberg and Tsunoda, I think, did okay, but Hamilton is the huge talking point there. 13th place for him, a really tough weekend ahead of him. I just wanted to look where it went wrong for Lewis Hamilton, because if you look at Hamilton versus Russell, again, they're Q2 lap times here, so they're both on the same tyre. I don't want to compare Russell's soft compound tyre at the end, but he went super early, did Lewis Hamilton, tried to do 2 fast laps at the end on his intermediate tyres, and I think just overheated them, and you can see that in the final sector, those tyres just completely fall off a cliff. He's actually a little bit quicker than George Russell through through the middle sector, made up a little bit of time, and then just the third sector completely falls apart. You can see through like turn 10, turn 11, he's got that DRS. They're going, oh no, sorry, didn't have DRS because it was Q2, but going through turn 11, Lewis Hamilton is still up, and then 12, 13, 14, just all falls apart for Lewis Hamilton. George Russell also seemed to be running a slightly higher downforce setup all weekend, as Hamilton was so much quicker on Friday in the dry, and then George Russell quicker in the wet, so maybe they are running slightly different setups, and we'll see how that plays out tomorrow, especially if it is a dry race. That might go against George Russell, but Lewis Hamilton has a lot to do tomorrow, and I think will struggle with overtaking, in my opinion. If you look at the cars in front of him, the Ferraris, the Williamses, they're very difficult to overtake in a straight line. Even the Alpine of Gasly looks really quick in a straight line in comparison to the Mercedes. So I think it's going to be a really big advantage for Lewis Hamilton that he's going to have to go for a different strategy and hope that it works out, because I don't think he's going to have the advantage on track. He's going to need to make that work off track for him. And then going into Q3, mix of intermediate and soft tires at the start, but slowly kind of swapped onto them. Everybody cottoned on that actually it was ready to go onto the soft compound tire. Max was on the radio preparing the tires after just a few corners on the intermediate tires. It was that obvious that the dry line was there, and you can see in this picture I wanted to just show, you can see that clear dry line, the grayer or the lighter gray tarmac that you can see. But it all went down to those final 3 minutes as we had a double red flag incident. The first of those being Logan Sargent. As I said before, he's a rookie. It shows. And even after 12 Grand Prix, he's just not quite there yet, is he? He hasn't just fully clicked with Formula One yet. It was his first time in Q3, and I was actually really excited to see him really take a step forward, because we know Albon has had the better of the upgrades so far this season, or at least had the upgrades first. This was Logan Sargent, the first time that we're really seeing him in the fully upgraded Williams, the same as Alex Albon has had for the last couple of races. And he just dipped those tyres onto the wet line, and as I showed you before, you know, you go onto that darker grey tarmac, it's a little bit more slippery, catches it. It's just such a shame for him in his first Q3 outing that he was the first person to put it in the wall. But again, I think it's the margins that you're running on the very, very thin dry line, and any kind of contact with the wet line and you're completely off. And that's all he did. Lots of damage, though, to that Williams car, and it will cost them, unfortunately. I think Williams, you know, we still talk about the fact that they're getting better and better, but they don't have the budget compared to some of those other teams. I know there's the cost cap there, but this is now taking money away from them that they could have used for development in different areas. This is why Mick Schumacher lost his seat at Haas last year, let's not forget. So Logan Sargent really needs to pull something out of the bag tomorrow, maybe a couple of points, and they'll forgive him all the same. But overall, they're having a great weekend, and I'll expand on that in a moment because we'll talk about Alex Albon, who has been sensational. But first and foremost, we have to talk about the second red flag, which was Charles Leclerc. Similar, came out of the corner a bit too hot, just got onto that slightly darker, slightly wetter part of the track and understeered into the barrier. You could see him really wrestling with the car. He actually didn't take his hands off the wheels. I think if we've learned anything from Daniel Ricciardo on Friday, you take your hands off the wheels, but he managed to, he was trying to get that Ferrari back on track, but as soon as he was on the grass, it was super slippery, and it kind of forced a one-lap shootout, because after the red flags, the track was a lot drier, that dry line was a lot bigger, and I think we should look at the top 6 because there's 6 different constructors in there, and we had this one-lap shootout where we could compare all 6 of them. If we look at Piastri first and foremost, who just missed out, came in 8th place to Carlos Sainz, who's in the sort of bottom of that 6 that I'm talking about. He's in 6th place tomorrow. Couple of areas where Piastri missed out. It was turn 6, 7, and 8. There's possibly a small mistake from Piastri in the middle there. I haven't seen the onboards, and I couldn't find the onboards to have a look, unfortunately. But you can just see how Carlos Sainz is carrying a lot more speed through that middle sector. And you can see also coming out of turn 4, the track is all red, apart from a tiny little portion of orange, all the way through 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And you can just see that Piastri loses out massively. Sainz almost hands it back to him. He lost loads of speed, But then Piastri through the final few corners also wasn't great. And Ferrari have that top line speed advantage, which is going to be huge for Sainz come tomorrow. Because if the track is dry, just having a top line speed advantage plus the DRS attacking down in towards turn 1, I think Carlos Sainz is first and foremost going to be a little bit better at attacking, but also going to be able to defend a little bit better. And they're going to need that because they're going to go through tyres like crazy tomorrow is all I'm thinking for the Ferrari guys. Then I wanted to look at Alonso versus Albon because this all came down to the first sector, and this is something that I'm going to repeat quite a few times over the next couple of minutes, but the first sector in particular for Williams this weekend was brilliant. I said the same about Logan Sargent, but Alex Albon to another T. Albon through turn 2, 3, and 4 just carries so much speed, and he was going purple through that first sector so often, and we constantly saw Albon quickest through the first sector, and then he was right up there with like Norris and Verstappen in terms of that first sector time. Alonso fought back over the course of the lap. You can see it slowly coming back towards the Aston Martin. There was a few hundredths he made up here and there, but Albon was just super quick all weekend, and I really hope he can turn this into a really big points position from 4th place tomorrow. I think the battle between him and Alonso is going to be really interesting to see, because I do think the Aston Martin is set up a little bit more for race pace in comparison to maybe Russell and Albon, who are in front of them. Because let's talk about Russell and Norris first and foremost before we talk about Verstappen as well. Norris was so good in the first sector as well. I told you, so much of this came down to that first sector for a lot of these guys. Norris really quick through that first sector, and Russell was massively down through the first half of the lap. You can see already 0.4 of a second down just halfway through the lap. Tried to reel that back in. Did fairly well to close the gap, but I think tomorrow we'll struggle to keep up with Norris and Verstappen, especially looking at the lack of pace on Friday from George Russell. And I think that opens up a really interesting battle between Russell, Albon, and Alonso, possibly Sainz, depending on the tyre wear of that Ferrari, and Sergio Perez coming into that battle as well. Like, those 5... any of those guys I could see ending up being on the podium. I think that's going to be a really tight battle between those guys. And then it's going to kind of be Norris and Verstappen who disappear away with it, because they were so much quicker than everybody else. Norris said himself he peaked too soon. And as I just mentioned, he had a solid first sector. And then you can see it just starts to dip away in the second sector. And then also the DRS being activated in Q3 and allowing Max to take advantage of the 2 DRS zones to just stretch that lead. It was... as Norris said, he just peaked that little bit too soon, got the tyres right into the window until halfway through the lap, and then they just dropped off a little bit. And you could see that in his second sector time. He went yellow in the second sector, which means he was slower than his personal best. So it was tough to really watch Lando Norris come around in that final lap. I thought he was going to be right up there with Max Verstappen in terms of qualifying pace, but it's very similar to what I said about Piastri. The middle part of the lap cost Lando Norris, and the middle part of the lap seems to be where that McLaren just isn't 100% settled. But moving into tomorrow, the big summary, I think we're going to end up with Max versus Norris. I think that battle is open. I think there is possibly going to be an attack from Lando Norris for the lead at some point. I don't think this is going to be a Max Verstappen walk in the park. I then think Russell, Albon, Alonso, those 3 behind look really closely together. Unless the Ferrari is also having some good tyre degradation on the day, I think then Sainz could even join that battle. But any of those guys could end up on the podium. It's going to be really interesting to see how that battle goes. Leclerc crashing once again, I think, is something that we need to discuss and will be discussed after this weekend. Fred Vasseur has already come out and sort of questioned it a little bit. You know, Charles Leclerc is quite crash happy. This is the second time already this season we've seen him crash in Q3, thinking back to Miami. First and foremost, I know that Ferrari have got almost an unlimited budget, but it does cost them money in this cost cap era. And secondly, Leclerc is just having a season to forget, really, at Ferrari. I know that they're making mistakes too, and the behind the scenes at Ferrari still aren't going great, but Leclerc isn't doing any favors for himself. And then Hamilton is in an absolute horror of a situation, just because I don't think the Mercedes car is going to quite have the race pace. I think Hamilton will actually have better race pace than Russell if it's dry tomorrow. But the fact that he's in that mix, the fact that he's got to get past Gasly and Stroll and Sainz and Perez, there's just so many cars in front of him that have a much better straight line speed advantage. Even Logan Sargent starting in 10th place, I think will be a tricky overtaking task for Lewis Hamilton. And I'd love to know what you think, though, in the comments down below. Who's going to win tomorrow? What's your top three? I think in particular that third place. I'd love to know who you think is going to come in third, because I think it's a real battle between these guys. And I think Alex Albon has a real opportunity at a podium in a Williams. And then I'd love to know who you think is going to come home in the points. Will Lewis Hamilton be able to get back up into that top 10? Will Logan Sargent finally get his first points in a Williams? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.